Thank you for viewing this workshop. The purpose of this workshop is to promote open and respectful dialogue between people, even about sensitive subjects. Now, why should you care about that? Well, have you ever been in a group where you felt like you either had to stay silent or compromise your views to fit in? Or maybe you've seen somebody personally shamed because of their views. Or do you have any friends with whom you just avoid certain topics because you don't want to hurt your relationship? If so, I think that lots of people have had those experiences. So you're in good company, and this workshop's for you. So here's our challenge. How can people with real and substantial differences in viewpoints coexist in a way that promotes the thriving of all people? This is a challenge really at all universities and in our society in general. When people talk about controversial topics, a helpful thing to understand is tolerance of diversity of conscience. But what is that? Here's a 3-minute video to illustrate.
Diversity makes the world a richer, more interesting place. It enhances our relationships. Educational institutions highly value diversity because our differences give us opportunities to learn from each other and to grow as people. But sometimes we differ when it comes to our opinions on issues near and dear to our hearts. We call this kind of diversity of conscience, because people of goodwill can search their conscience and earnestly disagree about what they think is right and wrong. What can we do? The solution is to practice tolerance through appreciation of each other's freedom of conscience. This means respecting legitimate differences of moral and religious conscience. Does this mean we should tolerate the views of a racist or a terrorist? No. Freedom of conscience has limits. Legitimate freedom of conscience is the liberty to make personal moral choices as long as those choices do not infringe on the rights of others or undermine the common good. Tolerance of diversity of conscience makes it possible for us to talk about controversial subjects in safety. By doing so, we respect each other, and we respect one another's right to follow one's own conscience, even if we do not agree. How is this different from acceptance? Acceptance connotes agreement with someone else's values, beliefs, or behavioral choices. But tolerance is what we need when we honestly disagree. Even when, in good conscience, we disagree, we still strive to love and respect the other person. Without tolerance of diversity of conscience, we can end up unfairly accusing others of hate, or of being a bigot, or of lacking a moral compass, because they disagree with what we think is right. When we do that, we are really saying, I have a right to follow my conscience, but you don't have a right to follow yours. Honest differences about controversial issues shouldn't lead to one side silencing or shaming the other. If we love and respect each other as persons, we'll stand up for everyone's freedom of moral and religious conscience. This kind of mutual respect enables us to discuss and debate tough issues without anger or alienation. In respectful dialogue, we seek first to understand each other. New understandings may lead us to modify our original views, or at the end of the day, we might agree to disagree and to live with our deepest differences of conscience. Either way, if we respect diversity of conscience, no matter what the issue, we'll keep goodwill and civility alive. Communities that embrace tolerance of diversity of conscience display open dialogue, humility by learning to listen better, more authentic diversity, and greater compassion and understanding between people. This is who we are.
Let's review. What is tolerance of diversity of conscience? It's respecting the legitimate differences of moral and religious conscience. Are there any limits to freedom of conscience? Yes. One has freedom to make personal moral choices as long as those choices don't infringe on the rights of others or undermine the common good. Maybe before we go further, let's take a few minutes to understand what we mean by conscience. Conscience is an act of reason whereby we apply our moral knowledge to a particular situation. So, conscience helps us know what's good to do in a particular situation. It can also weigh in a kind of evaluative way after we do something to let us know if what we did was good or bad. So, said differently, conscience is the exercise of practical reason on matters of moral significance. So, here's a little more about conscience. Conscience applies just to your own actions. Correctly understood, your conscience does not tell you what other people ought to do, only yourself. Second, it's a judgment of practical reason. This is important to understand. In other words, it's what your reason tells you is good after weighing everything that it can. This relates to the third point. It's the reason why conscience is fallible. There are lots of opportunities for error between self-evident first principles that everyone agrees on, like, for example, do good and avoid evil, and a specific moral situation. People can and do come up with opposite conscience-dictated courses of action because our conscience can be wrong. Now, even though this is the case, we're still morally obliged not to act against our conscience. This is because at the end of the day, when we've evaluated the situation the best we can, our verdict of conscience is what we believe to be good. You may be interested to know that everyone seems to agree with this. Religious thinkers, secular thinkers, even strict subjectivists agree that we are morally obliged not to act against our conscience. Why? The reason is that going against our conscience would be, by definition, choosing to do what we believe to be bad, and that's evil. So here's food for thought. You may be obligated to follow your conscience, but that doesn't mean that the action you've chosen is objectively good. If your conscience is mistaken, you're right to act on it, even though the behavior may be objectively wrong. But that's a discussion for another time. Finally, our conscience doesn't operate in isolation. It's informed by lots of things, including the broad universal moral principles. Thomas Aquinas and others called this synderesis, or knowledge of God's law within us. Conscience is also influenced by our life experiences and, of course, all the nuances and complexities that we're able to grasp about the moral situation in question. It may not surprise you to know that conscience is informed also by the values that we've internalized from our culture, religion, family, and friends. But it may surprise you to know how vastly different people's experiences of this can be. For some, these early value systems are sort of swallowed whole and remain unexamined influences within them. Often, this leads to an experience of just kind of rule following that falls apart when it meets the complexity of real-life moral situations. But a better experience of conscience is possible. This is one in which we've taken the time and had the courage to examine and understand the values of our parents and the values of our religion, etc. We've asked, why are those beliefs held? And evaluated the answers for ourselves. Only then are we personally able to decide what we value and why, and to integrate those beliefs in a deeper way that we now own them. This is a much different experience of conscience, and it's a much more stable foundation. And it's sort of one in which the voices of culture, religion, parents, etc. are no longer experienced as authoritarian, but instead feel kind of more like consulting trusted advisors. Now we have a pretty good idea about what conscience is. Let's take a quick look at what it isn't. First, conscience can't create its own truth. Something can be right or wrong independent of what my conscience says about it. Also, conscience isn't free from universal moral principles, such as do good and avoid evil. And finally, conscience is not merely a feeling or an opinion. In other words, it can't be reduced to a subjective psychological state that's akin to like a personal preference. Subjective states can't be true or false, or even morally relevant. For example, it makes no sense to say that my favorite dog is a Labrador. is morally good or bad, or even true in any broader sense than meaning that it is just true for me. So, with our understanding of conscience and with the idea of tolerance of freedom of conscience in mind, let's take a look at a framework for civil discourse using the cardinal virtues. A quick note about virtues. Virtues are not rules to follow. Virtues are habits of character that we cultivate in ourselves that help us flourish as human beings. So, why are we talking about virtues with regard to civil discourse? Well, the virtues provide safe parameters for discussion. If we're trying to apply the virtues, we're holding ourselves accountable to a very positive standard. And it's a standard that promotes civility and fairness for all parties in the conversation. The cardinal virtues are the four foundational virtues. All other virtues can in some way be reduced to these four, and they've been valued since at least the time of the ancient Greeks. Research shows that these virtues are prized by virtually all cultures around the world. So essentially, everybody agrees that these represent commendable behavior. So for these reasons, we can look to the cardinal virtues to give us some universal parameters for civil dialogue. So what are these virtues? Prudence, or wisdom, is the most important virtue because it's the most closely associated with reason. So it kind of governs all of the other virtues. Prudence weighs all of the factors in a situation in order to choose the action most likely to bring about what you want. So in this case, the goal would be an open and respectful conversation about a controversial topic. So what might prudence look like in this context? It might look like wisely choosing the time and place to have the difficult conversation. Or it might look like using humor to diffuse the tension. Our next virtue, temperance, has to do with self-control. Temperance might look like being polite and using your manners, or maybe pausing and taking time to think when you're challenged. Our next virtue, courage, also called fortitude, has to do with standing firm in the face of difficulty or danger. Courage is also persisting and not despairing when the goals are hard to reach or you've encountered a lot of obstacles. Examples of courage are being brave enough to share your own view, and also daring to really listen to the other person's point of view. Who knows, you might even modify your original view based on what you've learned. When we feel threatened in a discussion, it's really easy to close down and resort to maybe name calling or telling people how they should be. It takes strength and courage to keep an open mind and to risk seeing things from a really different point of view. But we just have to have that kind of inner strength if we really want to understand one another. Our final virtue, justice, is fairness. It's giving a person what is due to that person. And in acting justly, we validate and respect the inherent dignity of every person. Some examples of justice are having the goal of understanding the other person, not just trying to convince them of your view. And maybe even forthrightly admitting what you don't know and taking ownership of your mistakes. How about this? Maybe even taking some measure of ownership for the mistakes of your religious or cultural group. So, in summary, the cardinal virtues can provide the ground rules for how we talk to each other, and this is especially important when it's a sensitive subject. Disagreement doesn't have to close down dialogue. People don't need to be silenced, and people don't need to stay separated because they disagree about something. At St. Mary's University, we value open dialogue between people. It's really what university life is all about. It's about being around a diverse group of people who hopefully have some different ideas than you so that you can learn from them and grow and be challenged and maybe even clarify your own beliefs. We hope that this workshop helps promote freer, deeper, and more compassionate dialogue within our community. Thank you so much for your participation.